started. Just a reminder that the session will be recorded. We will ask you to enter your questions in the chat at the end of the presentation. And please don't forget to fill out a survey that will be sent to you immediately after the presentation to let us know you were present today and to give a brief feedback on the presentation you have heard. The presentation today is coming to us from the Division of Infectious Diseases, and I will ask the Chief of ID, Marcel Baird, to please present our speakers. Thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you, Nadia, and welcome everybody to Grand Rounds today. It's going to be given by two speakers, our own Marina Klein and Dr. Jim Young, who is generally based in New Zealand. But basically, we know Marina all from a McGill graduate. She's a professor of medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases, associate member of Epi and Biostats. She leads the clinical research program platform of MI4. She's national co-director of the CIHR Canadian HIV Trial Network. And her research builds upon years of multidisciplinary work to lead one of the largest cohorts focused on HIV and Hep C co-infection in the world. She's Canada Research Chair in Clinical and Epidemiologic Studies of Chronic Viral Infections in Vulnerable Populations. And her goal is to pave the way to eliminating Hep C and other chronic viral infections in Canada and globally. To this end, she's leading an ambitious project called Montréal sans Hep C, which aims to make Montreal the first city in North America to eliminate Hep C. She will be presenting with Dr. Jim Young. Dr. Young has a PhD in applied statistics, and over the past 20 years has worked as a biostatistician specializing in analyses of observational data from HIV cohorts. He worked for and still collaborates with the Basel Institute of Clinical Epidemiology in Switzerland. He prefers to use Bayesian statistical methods, and his work at the Canadian co-infection cohorts has given him many opportunities to employ and develop these skills. And although he works in Canada and he works in Basel, outside of work, he exercises by running in the hills of New Zealand. So I imagine at some point he's actually living in New Zealand, but working in Canada and Switzerland at the same time. And we really look forward to hearing their combined rounds, which is entitled Publishing in a Pandemic, Press Releases, Preprints, and Peer Review. Thank you, Marina and Jim.
Thank you so much, Marcel. Thanks, Nadia, and every one of you who's here today to listen. So at this point in the pandemic, we thought it was a good opportunity to take some time to reflect upon the last few years. In essence, take a breath from this furious deluge of information and consider what the COVID pandemic has revealed about the way science is conducted and disseminated. And some of this you'll have heard before. Indeed, the problem with medical publishing has been evident for some time, and the pandemic has only served to amplify these problems. Some of this may be new to you, hopefully. Some of what we have to say may be controversial, but our aim is really simply to provide some thought and start conversations about how, perhaps to borrow a phrase that's tired and overused by our politicians, build back better after the pandemic. These are my disclosures, both from industry and peer-reviewed funding. Jim does not have any disclosures, so he won't have a disclosures slide to show. So I'm going to start by a quick poll. So please be honest. This is anonymous, so no one's keeping track. Where do you get your information on COVID-19 most often? Traditional medical journals, preprint servers, traditional media, for example, newspapers, television, radio, social media, medical digests, such as Medscape, DG Alerts, different medical societies. I'll let this go for a few minutes. I mean, personally, there's so much information out there. I think we all need a sort of screening mechanism to get our way in. If we were to review all the medical journals that are out there on a daily basis, we would never do any other work. So we probably need to go elsewhere. So I'm going to let this poll go for another 10 seconds. So get your votes in now and we'll end the poll. So it looks like, interestingly, Traditional media serves as one of the top ways people get their information, 68%, followed by traditional medical journals. So it's interesting. I think many of us start in that way and are led back to the journals to get more results. So I'm going to show those results. I hope you can see them. Okay, and then we're going to move on to, hopefully this works, a second poll. No, it's not working. Okay. I don't know if I can do the second poll. I'll skip the second poll because it's not working. I'm sorry. So basically, our objective today is really to try to understand some of the reasons why the current model of medical publishing is failing and what the consequences of a failing model has for science and for public health. And more importantly, I think, is to start to consider some strategies for improving the process of medical publishing, because we all have an invested stake in this, even more so than ever, I think. And if we want things to improve, I think collectively, we need to start to influence that. Okay, so now I have the second poll, which has come up, and it is asking, does medical publishing work for you? So I want to think, is it not at all, somewhat, most of the time, or always? So I'll give you a few seconds. Go, give it 30 seconds so we don't waste too much time. And okay, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So what we can see is that somewhat and most of the time are the most popular choices, but there are some of you who feel it's not working at all. So let's see how you feel after this is over. Okay. So let's take us back to that time almost 2 years ago, March 2020. I don't know that we want to go back there. It was not it was a difficult time. Cases are rising rapidly. We were struggling to know how to respond. We were lacking PPE. Cases were coming into our hospital, and there was an urgent need for information about how best to protect ourselves, to manage patients who are infected. And there was really very little to guide us out there. So I just want to raise, a shout out to Makeda Semret, who throughout the pandemic has led us, a group of us, in coming up with empiric management guidelines for COVID-19 for adults at the MUHC. And this was a group of us who met quite regularly through email and through Zoom meetings to try to come up with the best evidence-based information to guide clinicians in what to do when patients were evaluated at our institution. And going back to our very first version, March 17th, 2020, you won't be surprised, or maybe you will be surprised to see that we listed hydroxychloroquine as for all patients who were admitted, in addition to numerous antibiotics and Remdesevir, basically operating in a vacuum with information that was flying around quite quickly. This became quite a heated debate in amongst the group, and actually only 10 days later, we revised to version 2, and you'll see noticeably that hydroxychloroquine has been removed. And this wasn't because actually new information had been emerged in the literature. This was because we were starting to understand the nature of the patients who were affected by COVID-19. Most of them were coming from the CHSLD. They were quite debilitated, elderly, had multiple comorbidities, many with cardiac disease. And we did know that there was very little evidence at that point for a benefit of hydroxychloroquine, and there was clearly some evidence that it could be harmful. And we felt at that point our duty was really to propose treatments with a balance against harming people, and it was removed. We had conversations with other institutions who had continued to use it for some time thereafter. And if we look at all the treatments and approaches to COVID-19 early in the pandemic and up till this day, most of them have been around, with the exception of vaccines, of course, which I'm not going to address in this talk, repurposing treatments, old treatments that have been used in other areas that could be rapidly deployed because their side effect profiles were known, to the treatment of COVID-19. And in fact, hydroxychloroquine features very heavily amongst these early treatments. Indeed, about 300 registered trials of hydroxychloroquine exist if you go into clinicaltrials.gov. And most of these have not yielded any positive results. 77 have been terminated or withdrawn. 68 are still recruiting, surprisingly, but a third of them have a planned sample size of less than 100. So this is in the mix of huge numbers of clinical trials and studies that are ongoing for COVID-19 around the world. At last look, which was last week, 7,000 studies were found for COVID-19. And most of these are on drug interventions, and very few are examining non-pharmaceutical interventions such as masks or distancing or other approaches. This has led to a lot of challenges, I feel. I think we experienced this all as academics, investigators, and clinicians. Reminiscent of the Turcotte interchange before the redevelopment, everybody out there wants in on the action. It's not just people who had experience with infectious disease or virology or who did respiratory illness. There were people from oncology who had used disease modulating agents, rheumatology, biochemists, all had a product or a molecule that they thought was going to be the next best, greatest treatment and cure for COVID-19. And particularly in Canada, but I think this occurred around the world, there were a lot of small funds distributed rapidly without any prioritization. And this led to a burden on human resources, on infrastructure of our institutions, on our research institutes, on our research ethics boards, on personnel, on patients, on caregivers, and numerous competing trials that were not well coordinated, which resulted in over-soliciting patients. We had one report during the pandemic where one patient complained to the ombudsman because they'd been contacted by 14 separate people asking them to participate in a clinical trial. All the while, case numbers are fluctuating, making it very difficult to know if we can recruit adequately and get adequately powered studies. And the research landscape is constantly changing with new standard of care evolving as we go. So very challenging environment. And this has had local impact. I can speak to it as director of the MI4CRP, where we had an infrastructure that was rapidly put in place by March to try to allow us to conduct both investigator-initiated and industry-funded studies for COVID-19. We received over 150 inquiries and actually received 97 protocols, 70 of which related to COVID that we fully reviewed. And in the end accepted 15. We were getting studies and requests to do studies on multiple drugs, which had very little evidence from in vitro data that they would be effective in COVID-19. And these were from people who were quite well established in the field, someone who invented lamivudine, 3TC, and an antiviral drug, for whom really some of these studies were quite crazy, what was being proposed. But in total, we did enroll 96 patients in COVID clinical trials. And we were not alone. We're only one group. There are many other investigators at the MUHC, both in Department of Medicine, Cardiology, Intensive Care Unit, who all conducted trials that have been either collaborative or useful in understanding what our best approaches are to this new disease. But as you can imagine, the sheer number and volume of studies had a major impact on our institution, on the REB, which is already stretched like an elastic pulled taut, and it's you added COVID to the mix, and it's about to explode. And as of December of last year, when I last looked through this, so had received over 120 projects involving interactions with patients and authorized 68 studies just at the MUHC. So you can see how this has become a ballooning enterprise. And so I think we struck this difficulty where we have this fine balance between society, which is for whom we should be conducting these studies to develop public health benefit and the best evidence possible to treat, particularly in early phases of COVID-19, the vulnerable patients who are most affected by this infection. The rapidly changing knowledge base and how to best communicate it so that it's taken up as quickly and as effectively as possible with the researcher who, let's be honest, in a system that rewards academics and bases career advancement on the H indexes and impact factors of the journals we publish in, COVID-19 was a gold mine. So yes, there were people who were genuinely motivated by discovery and academic pursuit, but there were a lot of examples where we might question whether this was more about career advancement. And it's not just those looking to make a career out of COVID that got swept up. Even very well-established scientists, and I think you'll all recognize who this is. This man is Didier Raoult from France, revealed that academics themselves couldn't resist getting caught up in this maelstrom of science. And this study that this refers to was published originally as a preprint, which appeared in March of 2020. So just about the time we were trying to develop our first COVID guidelines that I showed you. It was a non-randomized study, 46 patients. The analyses were poorly done. And it's been cited over 500 times, while a larger randomized trial posted also on a preprint server on April 14th, which showed no benefits, received much less attention. This went on to be published in the International Journal of Antimicrobial Agents with an accompanying editorial, despite the controversy, saying that, well, we have very little information, so any little information is better. Well, is it? I guess is a question we could ask. This isn't the only drug for which there's been a tremendous amount of hype. I think most of us on the infectious disease mailing list gets a regular email from the McGill community asking doctors, why have you not supported the use of this miracle drug, ivermectin, given all the studies out there that have shown that it saves lives? Well, does it? We hold up meta-analyses and systematic reviews as sort of the pinnacle of medical research in terms of synthesizing medical evidence. And not one, but two meta-analyses of ivermectin for the prevention and treatment of co-infection have been published, both of which showed perhaps some benefit, but rapidly had to be retracted because the paper, which was the largest study included in these meta-analyses, which had appeared in a preprint and subsequently was retracted due to concerns about fraudulent data, accounted for 15% of the effect observed in the meta-analysis and really swayed it to having any potential effect. But the problem is once this was out there, look, these are these article level metrics that you can get. It's been tweeted 43,000 times, picked up by 73 news outlets. And so you can see it becomes and develops a life of its own. And this isn't just internationally. We had our own example much closer to home. Here's a study from the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, which showed that there was a 1 in 1,000 risk of myocarditis associated to mRNA vaccination. And at a critical time, this was published when we were really trying to roll out vaccination to the youth in our country and elsewhere. But it turns out instead of the 32,000 vaccine doses that was in the denominator used in the initial analysis, there were actually 800,000 doses given at that same time period. So if you evaluated what the true risk was, it was more like 1 in 25,000, not 1 in 1,000. But I think this is telling the quote that comes from Peter Liu, the scientific director at the Heart Institute. Well, we were doing this on the run in a way. We were getting kind of preliminary vaccination rate data. So it turns out that the number was not complete. Again, 5 news outlets, 10,000 tweets, and an anti-vaccination campaign that's growing in strength around the world. Press releases, another way to disseminate medical information. And I like this example of Remdesevir because it's a sort of tit for tat argument going on between the company Gilead, who developed and tested this drug initially, and the WHO. So we could see is that, this comes from the Financial Times, which sources Bloomberg information, how the stock price of Gilead, the company, became a proxy for investor sentiment in the whole stock market itself. So in blue, you see the Gilead share price at key events over the timeline, which I'll go through in a moment, and then red, this S&P 500. And in fact, it's the first time where one company's stock fortunes really mirrored the whole stock market. So in April 23rd of 2020, Gilead Sciences hastily puts out a statement saying that the WHO had prematurely posted data from a Chinese study that didn't show any benefit of remdesivir. On April 29th, the Lancet publishes this study, which showed no benefit in time to clinical improvement. But that same, it's published in the UK, so a little bit of few hours time advantage. By that afternoon, the NIH and Gilead leads a press release reporting that time to recovery in their study is significantly reduced. And then Anthony Fauci, who gets out from the NIH, says the drug shows clear-cut significant positive effects, and up goes the stock price. On November 5th, the trial on which that data was based was published in the New England Journal, confirming the same finding about time to recovery in that population. Not long after, the WHO recommends against the use of remdesivir in hospitalized patients based on an interim analysis that they conducted of their study, the Solidarity trial. And so here's the NIH saying their trial is working really well, stock's going up, some volatility in the market, and as we see, it starts to crash as the WHO cautions against remdesivir. And they finally published the results in the New England on February 11th, which shows no benefit in hospitalized patients for overall mortality, initiation of ventilation, or duration of hospital stay. Meanwhile, this drug is approved by the FDA and is used quite widely, and the US has actually bought up the majority of the drug. This isn't just press release. In the big scheme, we see this example closer to home. And here's this a trial that I think many of you are quite well aware of, which was conducted by the Heart Institute, looking at colchicine. And I like this title, "We Need Release from Science by Press Release. Unless you suffer from gout, colchicine is not a drug that one would be familiar with." They studied 4,488 patients, and their study approached statistical significance. But this allowed them to claim that this was a major scientific discovery and would be the world's first oral drug that could be used to treat non-hospitalized patients. The final results were indeed published. Their primary endpoint, which was hospitalization, occurred in 4.7% of the group exposed to colchicine and 5.8% of the patients not in the placebo group. So even if there was a difference between these, which didn't achieve statistical significance in the end, it was a really minimal difference, effectively about 1%. We all know that this trial in itself caused great difficulty in the research community here in terms of the emphasis and that was put on it and funding from our provincial government, in addition to the effect it had on access to patients with COVID-19 during this patient for other trials. And so it shows where you can put a tremendous amount of resources to repurposing a drug that was likely not to have major benefit. And it continues. We hope that some of the new antivirals will be much more effective. These are directed against COVID-19 and have the potential. When interim analysis was released by press release of molnupiravir, Merck drug, which showed at that time apparent 50% reduction in hospitalization if you received this early amongst high-risk patients, enough to stop the trial early and seek regulatory approval and authorization. If authorized, it could be the first oral medication for COVID-19. Well, last Friday, less effective in the final analysis. We'll never probably know the final effectiveness of this drug because the trial was stopped early. We were actually a site in this trial and never recruited any patients before the trial was closed. In fact, it looks like it's more like 30% in the final analysis. It's still not published. More of the same? Well, we hopefully not. Pfizer has a new drug, which is an oral candidate, which showed 89% efficacy in interim analysis. Also stopped early. Still not published. We cannot know its ultimate effectiveness until we can evaluate the data. What about the traditional medical journals in terms of a source of publishing? Well, even there we've had trouble. So here's a nice place to go for looking at where happens to science after it's been published. 192 papers and counting have been retracted related to COVID-19 since the beginning of the pandemic. You're probably aware of this example, which we lovingly call the Remdesevir debacle. So not one, but two major journals were taken in by this seemingly a company that appeared out of nowhere, which held a huge amount of data and had a hastily put together website. And it wasn't until after the Lancet published this paper, which purported to show that hydroxychloroquine had potential detrimental effect with respect to cardiovascular disease in patients who'd received it. And the WHO halted their clinical trials involving hydroxychloroquine because of this study, that some astute Australian noticed that there were far more people in this database from Australia than had been diagnosed with COVID in their country. And it seemed that there was something amiss. And further analysis of this paper by numerous people afterwards pointed out many flaws that suggested that it was indeed fraudulent. It wasn't the journal that retracted this paper, but indeed one of the authors who requested it be retracted because, quote, all the authors were not granted access to the raw data and raw data could not be made available to a third party. They therefore requested the article be retracted and apologized to the editors and the readers of the journal for the difficulties this has caused. It's not to say that there haven't been good papers published in major journals. I just put two examples here from people who participated in collaborative work that are from the MUHC, Emily McDonald and Todd Lee in this paper that were published in the New England Journal of Medicine on randomized post-exposure prophylaxis of hydroxychloroquine, and a study called Concord on convalescent plasma. Neither showed benefit. So this is really what we see, that like the exponential growth of the virus, we've seen an exponential growth in publications. At one point estimated in this paper, which is a review in Nature last year, over 200,000 coronavirus journal articles had been published by December 2020. It's no doubt continued to increase. This is both in the traditional medical journals as well as in preprints. In fact, before COVID-19, there were very few articles published by preprints, less than say 50 per month. At the height of this, we had over 500 papers published per month on preprint servers. The vast majority, shown in blue here, relate to COVID-19. Where are these coming from? Well, not surprisingly, initially, most of the papers were coming out of China. This fell off as the COVID epidemic progressed and to involve more of the Europe and the United States, who now account for most of the papers. And not surprisingly, the impact has been that while the time to review of a COVID paper has been markedly fast, lickety-split here, we get down to, at the peak, less than 10 days for some papers to be published, which does make you concerned about the quality of the review that they are getting. Non-COVID related research has suffered, and on average, the time to review has gone up to around over 100 days on average. There are many who have highlighted these issues, and this is just one editorial which appeared in the BMJ about the impact that this has on sabotaging our effective evidence-based approach. It's not to say that amongst all this, there aren't some positives. And there are some positives for having more provision of open access to studies, increased collaboration, and expedited governance and ethics approvals that allowed us to do clinical studies much more rapidly. And in fact, I'd like to end by saying that there were some of what we've really learned, I think, is the power of collaborative research across multiple centers. These are just two examples: the recovery study out of the United Kingdom and the Solidarity trial from the WHO, both of which are international collaborative programs that have included large numbers of patients and really have been the only two to show us what major treatments do and can be effective in the pandemic. And where are we left at this stage in terms of what we have as an armamentarium for treatment? Not very much, really. Remdesivir, questionable. Convalescent plasma doesn't work. Only monoclonal antibodies, which have been developed largely in the industry space, but the rest of our interventions have really come out of work from the solidarity and recovery trials. So what I would suggest you do if you're deluged with all this information, this is an excellent website to visit. This is a living guideline for drugs related to COVID-19 that's put together by the WHO and updated regularly at the BMJ site, and shows all the major ones that have been tested. In this view, you only see the recommendation, but if you click on that, you can see all the evidence below and you can make those decisions more in depth yourself if you want to be linked to the original studies. And there's our most recent version of the guidelines. As you can see, they've been updated considerably. We've adopted the multicolor approach of the BMJ just to make it more lively, and very few things are left here than were before. And we're hoping that the future will bring some other interventions that can help address this difficult, continuing to be difficult disease. So I'm going to stop now, and as Jim prepares his material, I'll just try to post this quiz. It's not working. That was before. Not doing very well. Okay, with my polls. Okay, can I post that poll? I won't waste time because I think we have a lot to hear from Jim. So I'm going to stop sharing, and without further ado, we'll let Jim take over.
Just getting sorted. Here we go. Hopefully you see something now. How does that look? Good?
Yep.
Excellent. Well, the pandemic, R0, simply put, the average number of people every infected person will transmit the virus to. I guess everybody learnt that at some stage, but if you were like me, you've promptly forgot it. But my goodness, we had a bit of a wake-up call. The basic property of infectious agents, a metric of how contagious something is. But you see, the same concept could be applied to the transmission of information. And what we've been subject to in parallel to the pandemic is an infodemic, an overabundance of information, both online and in print. And that includes misinformation and disinformation. But even with that stripped out, we still have an overabundance of information, a mixture of, unfortunately, mostly poor quality information, some good, but as a consequence, it's very hard to detect signal from the noise. Like most of the trends we're highlighting in this session, an infodemic is a far older idea. The current pandemic has accelerated these trends or amplified their effects. Clearly, the infodemic has had negative consequences for public health, an increasing distrust of science, public health measures ignored, vaccines unused, ineffectual or harmful treatments promoted. The WHO has become concerned by this and the technology that is enabling and amplifying it, and has actually devoted resources to trying to rein it in. The problem is that when people want information and there isn't any, poor quality information fills that vacuum. Poor quality science is the first cab off the rank. Quality takes longer, and then it takes a long time to get good quality research done, written up and peer reviewed. And then that high quality information has the added battle of trying to overcome the poor quality information that has preceded it. It's hard at times to sort good science from bad, worthwhile hypotheses from conjecture, hyperbole and nonsense. The result is widespread confusion and scarce resources being squandered. Preprints are part of this problem. Scientists have embraced preprints. Thousands of preprints have submitted to servers every month, and the gold rush to be first. Make your findings quickly available, unshackled from sluggish and tyrannical journals. More about those sluggish and tyrannical journals later. This was all very well when only scientists and scientific journalists were paying attention, but now the problem is information that's incorrect is seized on and weaponized. In earlier times, a basic error in this preprint would not have been a problem. It would have been corrected. It was corrected within a week. And this would have just been peer review working as it should. But now, a mistake like this can do real serious harm, and I think it probably already has, unfortunately. Even traditional journals are contributing to this avalanche of poor quality information. It's a sort of scientific version of clickbait. These research projects generate headlines, which is good for journal citations. As a Bayesian statistician, any sensible prior would show that these findings are more likely to be wrong. And this line of thinking led to a very famous paper that you're probably aware of by John Ioannidis, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. This is the most highly cited paper ever in PLOS medicine. So poor quality information is having direct negative consequences for scientists too, not just indirectly through increasing public distrust in science. And that's because information has to compete for our attention. There's this idea in psychology of the attention economy. Attention is the bottleneck of human thought. When we receive information from traditional publishing, we take that information on trust. We don't tend to be so critical. If it's clickbait science, that's a problem. For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. I've always loved this quote. It's attributed to the witty curmudgeon H.L. Mencken. He's an American journalist, satirist, and cultural critic who wrote something like this in the 1920s. But clearly, the internet has accelerated the ability of that simple solution to travel so much further and faster. High quality takes longer. It's invariably more complex, and it struggles to compete with that early clickbait answer. There's this lovely idea in psychology that's become known as Miller's law, that we can only, our working memory is limited to holding about 7 ideas at any one time. The magical number is 7. Plus or minus 2, some limits on our capacity for processing information. So we get overwhelmed by information. Too much information is bad for good decisions. You need information to make decisions, but essentially too much of it overwhelms you. So we need less information, we need better information. So how did we get here? How did we get overwhelmed by poor quality information, even from traditional published journals that we trust? Why is this? Well, in my view, the system of scientific publishing is broken from everyone's perspective, except that of the publisher. Scientists are all slaves to publisher. What other industry receives its raw materials from its customers, gets those same customers to carry out quality control, and then sells the same materials back to the customer at a vastly inflated price? Deutsche Bank, when it reviewed the system of scientific publishing, was quite incredulous. It could hardly believe that this system actually seems to exist. Don't expect publishers to change anything, however, because they're raking in money. 2010, Elsevier's profit margin was right up there with the tech giants of the day. There's a wonderful article in The Guardian, which I highly recommend. Traces the history of academic publishing and shows how the model we operate under today was designed by one Robert Maxwell. Put bluntly, top journals need clickbait science to stay top journals, and scientists who provide it will be rewarded by being highly cited. This is not good for science. There is good science being done, but clickbait science is just very wasteful of resources. Meanwhile, in a galaxy far, far away, in Kazakhstan, a computer science student, Alexander Elbakyan, set up Sci-Hub in 2011. Now, I was not really very familiar with it. I'd never heard of Sci-Hub till I started looking into all of this. It's fascinating. I'd sort of recommend you don't look at it. It's completely illegal. But if you do, here's what you'll find. This is the front end. Sci-Hub obtains paywalled articles using leaked credentials. So all you do is you enter the digital object identifier, the DOI of the paper you want, and click open. If it's there in the repository, you'll get it immediately. Otherwise, a wait screen appears while the site presents someone else's credentials on your behalf to various proxy servers in order to get access to the paper, which eventually will be presented to you, and a copy will be stored in the repository. In March 2017, the website had 62 million papers in its collection, approximately 85% of all articles published in paywall scientific journals. Analysis of the traffic at this website suggests that much of it comes from developed countries by those who probably could have legitimate access to these journals. But they use Sci-Hub because it's so much faster. Think of how long it takes you to download legitimately an article from a journal through the library systems that you use. Every journal has a different way of searching for the paper you want. Every journal has a different way of downloading that to your computer. This thing is so fast and simple. It's almost as if scientific publishers want to make information as difficult to access as possible. Well, as you can imagine, scientific publishers are not too enthusiastic about this. Elsevier recently obtained a $15 million injunction against Sci-Hub, the maximum allowable under the law. Some doubt that the publishing giant will ever see any money from the pirate site. El-Bakian's defense is a lack of universal access to scientific information violates Article 27 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Her current whereabouts is unknown. She's believed to be in Russia. How did we come to this? Well, history suggests that Sci-Hub will be replaced by a new business model where content is far more reasonably priced. Nobody shares MP3 files anymore. We pay a quite reasonable premium to stream music through Spotify. Likewise, BitTorrent, which broke up movie files into small chunks so you could download them without being detected. I don't know anyone who uses BitTorrent much now. Netflix and other streaming services. Sci-Hub, what would it be replaced with? I don't know. But if you're a small institution or you're in the developing world, why will you pay for the big deal? The big deal is when these scientific publishers package up all their journals into a big bundle and they sell you this bundle. Here, the Université de Montréal rejected the bundle offered by Taylor and Francis, which was going to cost them $500,000 a year. Many of those journals they simply didn't need. So now they just subscribe to the journals that are most widely used by the researchers working there. And then they'll probably just go, oh, well, yeah, I don't know, for those other ones. And academics will go off to Sci-Hub and pull out the papers they want. Why would you pay more for open access? Essentially, once your paper is in Sci-Hub, it is open access. But Sci-Hub is not the answer, it's parasitic. It doesn't really improve the quality of information. You download stolen content and leave, as Elsevier put it. But this is a big deal. As one researcher at the NIA said, if you control access to scientific literature, it's like controlling science itself. Omnishambles, one of my favorite words. I find I use it more and more often in modern life. A situation that's been completely mismanaged, characterized by a string of blunders and miscalculations. I think we've got a good omnishambles going here. We've got journals and authors chasing impact factors, distorting research priorities. Peer review, variable quality at best. Anonymity allows feuding, theft of ideas, and it's way too slow. Few opportunities to detect fraud after publication. Peer review is not designed to detect fraud. The Remdesivir debacle suggests the best way to do that is through post-publication review, a sort of scientific crowdfunding. Journals almost never retract the paper until it's completely discredited. And unfortunately, preprint servers are unfiltered repositories of rubbish and ill-informed comment. Well, I didn't want to end like that. I wanted to end on a more positive note, not just to identify problems, but to at least come up with something that might work a bit better. And I wondered why those who pay for all this, that is essentially the state, why they can't force change, at least in theory. He who pays the piper calls the tune. These are some ideas from librarians who it turns out librarians are thinking along the same lines as I am. Sci-Hub, it's a symptom of an unsustainable business model. Sci-Hub will weaken all conventional publishing models, and this presents a risk that the scientific publishing industry could fold, and then the public sector would need to step in. Funding bodies need to implement change. In place of reporting for a grant, researchers would be required to put a publication in a government open access journal. So here's my idea of the brave new world. Major funders set up a new preprint server. And here I'm thinking a bit like clinicaltrials.gov, which was created as a result of a legislative act and implemented by the NIH. Research grants include the cost of peer review, but not the cost of publication. There's been debate about whether reviewers ought to be paid for their work. I worked for about 3 years as the statistical advisor for the Swiss Medical Weekly. I was paid 100 francs an hour, and each review took between 2 and 4 hours. Publishers haven't really been enthusiastic about the idea of paying reviewers. Well, they wouldn't, would they? Here's what they've offered instead: official recognition. As one researcher wrote, "Hey, academic publishers, your profit margin is like 30%. If you want to recognize me for peer review, pay me. Pay everyone who reviews for you." Reviewers should be selected from a pool. Reviews should not be anonymous. The College of Reviewers is an example of the sort of pool of reviewers that you might use under this system. Revised manuscript, reviews, and the author's reply posted on this new preprint server. Comment allowed, but only via your ORCID ID. If you've not got one, it's a relatively new development. It's sort of like a digital passport for researchers. And like the MED archive, this new preprint server would allocate a DOI to each manuscript, and that would be searchable via PubMed. Now, at that point, that's all the state really requires of you. That the summary of your work be reviewed by a competent reviewer and made publicly available. If you in a journal decide to pick up and publish that paper, that's fine, but it's not necessary. It's not necessary for the people who are paying for research to be done. You might like it, but they shouldn't care. So there's my brave new world. And I finish with a quote from Doug Altman, who was very influential on me when I was a statistical reviewer for the Swiss Medical Weekly. We need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons. Abandoning using the number of publications as a measure of ability would be a start. Richard Smith of the BMJ, who published that editorial from Doug Altman, said 20 years later, "Like Altman, I thought that was mainly because too much medical research was being conducted by amateurs. It took me a while to understand that the reasons were deeper." People aren't the problem. The system of scientific publishing is the problem. It's the system's problem. The pandemic has amplified existing problems in scientific publishing and is accelerating the need for change. And indeed, I think it's accelerating change itself. I rest my case. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jim and Marina for this extensive review of a very complex topic, very important and very topical these days. So beyond COVID and the whole really topic of scientific publishing, you made reference to this in your last few statements. How extensive? I mean, we clearly in the COVID area, we have clearly made more of an effort, I guess, to scrutinize things. Data has come out much more quickly. But looking back, how extensive of a problem do you think this has been sort of all along? I would just kind of like your opinion, Jim, on this. Do you think it's been a big problem or really,
Yeah,
that
I
much
do
worse
actually.
for COVID?
The quote I took from Doug Altman was from an article he wrote back in, I think it was 99, called "The Scandal of Poor Quality Medical Research." If I can just say, 20 years later, Richard Smith, the editor of the BMJ, wrote, "Sadly, the BMJ could publish this editorial almost unchanged this week." I don't think there's anything new here. It's just become more obvious, and the consequences are clear. Through this pandemic, there's just been one sort of publishing disaster after another. It must erode public distrust in science.
So there are some questions that are coming in the chat. I just remind everyone that you can enter your questions in the chat. One of the comments here is a large part of the problem is due to explosion of predatory journals, now over 15,000 by Omics, Hilarious, and many others. These publish non-peer-reviewed papers as reviewed and bootlegging and other falsehoods for monies. The question really is, what about open access data? Will that help in reducing fraud? Marina, any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about the Remdesevir example and what occurred at the Lancet, for example, after that, and what they instituted in response. So while they didn't retract it, they did say that they will change their journal editorial policies as a consequence, something that you think should have been in place before. But we are required when we submit articles to these major journals to state that we've had control of the data, that we've had access to it, that we've reviewed it prior to submitting. So that was already in place. But now that they required 2 of the authors on every paper to make that statement, they require a data scientist also for large data sets be involved in all the editorial reviews. And they're requiring that somebody with expertise in the particular database that's being used be one of the reviewers. So is that the answer, to have more kind of, I don't know. I think open source data will allow, I think what Jim was trying to propose, and he can speak to this a little bit more, is that I think that the involvement of the scientific community at large has been really interesting in terms of uncovering many of these instances of fraud. And we should probably try to harness that in a much more deliberate way in peer review, not just rely on, we all know the quality of peer review is highly variable. When we get a paper back, it can be 5 lines from somebody to someone who's done a really exhaustive review. And so that how do we integrate that in a much more comprehensive way? True peer review, I think, might be something that could come out of all of this. Jim, you might have some other comments about that.
Oh, I was just replying to a comment there. Sorry, say that again. Excuse me.
I was just wondering if you it's too much going on, how we could better integrate the kind of post publication peer assessment of articles on sort of ongoing review after publication.
Yeah, I actually think post publication review is totally important, because when the amount of reviewing that goes on before a publication is very limited, and the experts that are chosen may not be able to consider all the particular facets of a manuscript. But what I don't want, and that's why I was trying to think of this idea of an environment where people can post comments, but I don't want anonymity. I just think anonymity breeds bad behavior. And I think that's why I think if you've got, there are plenty of scientists out there who have their own blogs, and I'm thinking here of Andrew Gelman, and people sign on to read his commentary, and he's always, it's his commentary, you know it is, and he's happy to stand beside it. And in my experience, when I was a reviewer, professional reviewer, everybody knew who the statistical reviewer was. It's not like I had any anonymity. It's fine. I think we need to get over this anonymity thing. I think we need to be much more open and allow comments from people. Post-review is important in that.
Thank you. Other comments are should chicken or the egg, says Makeda Semret. Should academic reward be as closely linked to publications?
I think it shouldn't be. I think that's really the key to meaningful changes, to separate that. It's a really dumb idea to link people's progression to their publication record. It's not helpful, totally.
Marina, you wanted to say something on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the most impactful work is done collaboratively, and then how do you actually even acknowledge that in that setting? And it really is, like Makeda says, it's sort of a chicken and the egg. It feeds that whole industry, the impact factor, and why you strive to get a publication in one of these very high impact journals, because it will have a major effect on your career advancement. Whereas it may not actually be the best science, and that best science may take longer, more collaboration, more deliberation, and have ultimately more impact. And so we have to find other ways to evaluate contribution in science than simply publications.
David Rosenblatt says, very interesting point, that what bothered him during COVID was the liberal use of percentage as endpoint rather than showing numerators and denominators. And I do, remember seeing that. We would see, huge percentages, but then when you looked at the number, if there's 6 people affected versus, 4 people affected, the absolutes don't seem that impressive. Any comments about that? Did you find we saw that more than we
I think I showed that in one of the examples I used with the culture scene example, but it's a long-standing tactic when you want to promote something that looks like a major, you talk about relative effects as opposed to absolute effects, because it always looks much more impressive when you present the relative difference between two arms. It's a well-known trick of the pharmaceutical trade.
Another comment on good review. Reviewers need to be rewarded, pay them. We're about to close out. I have a question for you, maybe a little bit thought-provoking. Obviously there were a lot of publications that came out that were retracted, as you showed. There was a lot of back and forth in the media about, chloroquine and other drugs. And I think, there was a lot of confusion about science and trust in scientists. And do you think, how important a role do you think this plays in the lack of trust that people have in scientists and everything that goes from the lack of trust to vaccine hesitation? Is there any data that looks at that?
Yeah, I haven't specifically reviewed that in perspective of someone studying it, but there seems to be a clear, unassailable link between those two. And the question is, how do we overcome that? Because who then becomes an authority which can be always trusted? You could see even the example between Gilead and the WHO. The WHO has skin in the game too, so it's not necessarily going to be the purveyor of the truth. And so this is going to always be an issue. And when we speak to the media, we have to be really cautious about how we do that, so that we try to, as much as possible, engage and just, give the best information we can, honestly, with the evidence we actually have.
Well, thank you so much. It is just about 1 o'clock. I'd like to thank you for this very important, thought-provoking, excellent presentation. And obviously there's a lot of work left to be done. And I hope maybe you can come back to speak to us in a couple of years to tell us how things have evolved over time and restore some of the faith that we have in science and publications. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much, everyone who participated. I wish you a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.